In 1943, over the skies of the Mediterranean, the Luftwaffe pilots were confident in their superiority. They had faced numerous opponents, and the thought of a challenge from an American squadron seemed almost laughable to them. For the German pilots, the very idea of facing black American aviators was seen as a far-fetched notion, one that seemed to defy all logic. To them, the very concept of black men flying advanced warplanes was an insult to their idea of military and racial superiority. The Germans believed that black pilots lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage to match their European counterparts in combat. The notion that these men, whom the Germans considered inferior, could stand up to their elite fighter units was dismissed as a joke. In Berlin, the high command of the Luftwaffe had little doubt in their minds. The racial ideology that permeated Nazi Germany told them that people of African descent were biologically and mentally incapable of operating complex machinery like fighter aircraft. These pilots were seen as mere novelties, not to be taken seriously in the brutal and high-tech environment of aerial combat. The German leadership believed that if such men were allowed to fly, it was nothing more than a propaganda stunt by the Americans, and they would fail as soon as they faced real combat. The Germans were convinced that their trained pilots, equipped with superior aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190, would make quick work of any American opposition, especially those from an unknown and supposedly inferior squadron. But for the men of the 99th Fighter Squadron, the Tuskegee Airmen, it was not just a matter of fighting for victory in the sky. It was something far deeper. It was a fight to prove themselves, not only as capable aviators, but as equals to the white pilots they had always been told were superior. These men had already faced and overcome barriers that no white pilot could understand. From being subjected to the strictest racial segregation in the United States, to training under the assumption that they were destined to fail, the Tuskegee Airmen had been underestimated their entire lives. But they were not ready to be defeated. Each flight, each mission, was a battle against both the enemy in the sky and the prejudices they faced on the ground. Despite the skepticism surrounding them, the Tuskegee pilots were determined to prove the world wrong. They had trained longer, worked harder, and had faced more obstacles than their white counterparts in the United States Army Air Forces. They had to prove that they were worthy of their place in the sky and that they could protect American bombers as effectively as any other fighter squadron. The pressure on these men was immense, not just to succeed, but to dismantle the racial barriers that had defined their lives up until that point. For them, each mission was more than just a tactical operation. It was a statement of their competence, courage, and the strength of their spirit. But the road to success was not an easy one. The 99th Squadron was treated with skepticism and even outright hostility by some of their fellow American officers, who questioned their ability and looked down on them because of their race. They were given outdated aircraft, often inferior to those used by their white counterparts, and were frequently assigned less challenging missions. Yet, as the war raged on, the Tuskegee pilots continued to train, fight, and prove their worth, not just to their superiors, but to the entire world. To the Germans, these black pilots, as they were initially labeled, were seen as nothing more than a diversion. But as the 99th Squadron began to rack up victories, it became clear that they were no ordinary group of aviators. They had come to shatter the myth that racial limitations existed in the cockpit. Each kill, each successful bomber escort mission, was a victory not just over the enemy, but over the deeply ingrained prejudices of the time. In the skies above Sicily, the air was thick with the sounds of combat as the Tuskegee Airmen prepared for their first real test against the enemy. German pilots, unprepared for the challenge they would face, were about to learn the hard truth. These men, whom they had dismissed as incapable, would not be an easy target. In the chaos of aerial combat, the Tuskegee pilots flew with precision and discipline, their skill and resolve growing with every mission. The early days of their combat career were filled with skepticism from both their enemies and their allies. But they were undeterred. They understood the stakes. Every mission was an opportunity to prove that their race did not define their ability, and that their skill as pilots was undeniable. It was not just about proving something to the Germans. It was about showing the world, and more importantly themselves, that they could stand alongside the best. As the war dragged on, the Tuskegee Airmen would go on to achieve remarkable feats that defied expectations. Their courage and determination would earn them the respect of their fellow pilots and the admiration of those who once doubted them. But for now, in the summer of 1943, as they took to the skies over Sicily for the first time, the Tuskegee pilots were still fighting to prove that they were more than the stereotypes that had been cast upon them. They were ready to show the world that they, too, had the right to be called heroes. This was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge the beliefs of an entire nation and forever change the perception of black men in military service. The battle for equality would continue, but the first victory had already been secured. The Tuskegee Airmen were no longer just pilots. They were symbols of a larger struggle for justice and equality, proving that the sky, like the world itself, could not be divided by race. On July 2, 1943, the skies over Sicily were filled with the roar of engines and the chaos of battle. For Charles B. Hall, a young black pilot from Brazil, Indiana, this was not just another mission. It was a moment that would forever change his life and the course of history. As part of the 99th Fighter Squadron, Hall had flown countless training missions, but now he faced the real test. The German Luftwaffe was notorious for its efficiency and prowess in the air. And to most, the idea of a black American pilot challenging their best seemed almost absurd. But Hall was about to prove that perception wrong. Flying his P-40 Warhawk, Hall and his squadron had been tasked with escorting American bombers over enemy territory. As they neared their target, two German Focke-Wulf 190s suddenly appeared on the horizon, diving toward the American bombers. Without hesitation, Hall maneuvered his aircraft to intercept them. In a moment of pure skill and precision, he lined up his shot and fired a long burst. The first German fighter, caught off guard, spiraled out of control and plunged toward the ground below. Hall had just made history. He had become the first black American pilot to shoot down a German aircraft in combat. The significance of Hall's victory wasn't lost on those who witnessed it, but to the German Luftwaffe, it was dismissed as a fluke, a random incident that could happen to any pilot. They couldn't comprehend that a black man, whom they had dismissed as incapable, had just outperformed one of their elite pilots. For them, the idea of a black pilot having the skill and courage to bring down one of their best aircraft was inconceivable. The German military's racial ideologies were deeply entrenched, and this victory challenged everything they believed about the capabilities of African Americans. But for Hall and the men of the 99th Fighter Squadron, this was more than just a victory in the air. It was a powerful statement. It was a declaration that race did not determine a man's ability to fight, to lead, or to succeed. Hall's achievement struck at the very heart of the racial prejudice that had plagued the United States and the world for centuries. In that moment, he proved that the men from Tuskegee were more than capable. They were a force to be reckoned with. The news of Hall's victory spread quickly among the American forces. While some celebrated it as a milestone, others, including many of the white pilots and commanders who had doubted the 99th Squadron, were slow to acknowledge the significance. They still clung to the belief that these black pilots were not equal to their white counterparts. But as more victories began to pile up, the skepticism began to wane. Hall's success was not a fluke. It was the first of many. Over the coming months, the 99th Squadron would continue to prove themselves in combat, demonstrating that they were every bit as skilled and capable as the most seasoned pilots in the U.S. Army Air Forces. For the black airmen of Tuskegee, this was the beginning of a long, hard-fought battle for respect. They had already faced the harsh realities of segregation and prejudice before even entering the military, and now they were up against the deep-seated racism that had been ingrained in military culture. But they weren't just fighting to win wars abroad. They were fighting to change the perceptions of an entire nation. Hall's victory became a symbol of their struggle, a beacon of hope that would inspire not only future generations of African American aviators, but also all those who had been told that they weren't good enough, that they didn't belong. The Germans, still unable to accept the idea that their racial superiority could be challenged, began to take note of the growing threat the Tuskegee Airmen posed. As the 99th Squadron continued to rack up victories, the German pilots' disbelief turned to grudging respect. They couldn't deny the effectiveness of these black pilots. They couldn't ignore the fact that the Tuskegee Airmen were flying just as well, if not better, than any other Allied fighter group. The myth of black inferiority was beginning to crumble, one aerial victory at a time. But the victory on July 2, 1943, was not just about one downed aircraft. It was about breaking barriers, smashing stereotypes, and proving that race had nothing to do with a man's ability to fight for freedom. It was the first step in a long journey that would forever change the course of history. Charles Hall's achievement on that fateful day in Sicily would be remembered not just for its military significance, but for its cultural impact. It proved that no matter the color of a man's skin, he could accomplish anything if given the chance. As the months passed and more black pilots from Tuskegee followed in Hall's footsteps, the 99th Squadron's reputation grew. Their success in combat, their ability to protect bombers with precision, and their growing kill count began to earn them the respect they had long been denied. Hall's first victory was the catalyst that ignited the potential of an entire squadron, and eventually, a legacy of excellence that would be remembered for generations to come. But in that moment, on July 2, 1943, as Hall watched the German plane plummet toward the earth, he had done more than just defeat an enemy in the sky. He had shattered a myth that had been perpetuated for centuries, and in doing so, had laid the groundwork for the future of African American pilots in the military. Hall's victory was not just a personal triumph. It was a victory for every black man and woman who had ever been told they couldn't achieve greatness because of their race. It was a turning point in the history of the United States military and a pivotal moment in the fight for equality and respect. And though it may have seemed like just another combat mission to those involved, the echoes of that day would resonate through history, changing the course of the war, the military, and society itself. In 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron found themselves stationed in Tunisia, on the front lines of the European theater, prepared to face their first real combat. Yet, despite their rigorous training and proven skills, they faced a different kind of battle. One not against the enemy in the skies, but against the deep-seated skepticism and prejudice from their own allies. This was not a challenge they had trained for, but one they would have to overcome if they were to prove themselves as equals to their white counterparts. As they arrived in North Africa, the squadron was tasked with less demanding patrol missions, a clear sign that their capabilities were doubted by those in charge. The initial assignments were far from the high-stakes combat they had anticipated. They were assigned to patrol the skies, keeping a watchful eye on enemy activity, but not engaging in the full-scale aerial battles that the rest of the fighter squadrons were involved in. It was as if their commanders, even some within the American ranks, expected them to fail, or at the very least, not measure up to the established standards. This initial skepticism was not just a matter of being overlooked. It was a clear indication of how deeply ingrained racial prejudice was, even within the ranks of the U.S. military. Some of the higher-ups, including Colonel William Meare, openly expressed doubts about the abilities of black pilots to handle the more demanding and dangerous tasks that were typically assigned to seasoned fighter squadrons. These doubts were not only a barrier to the men of the 99th Squadron, but they also led to an atmosphere of resentment and frustration. The men of the 99th Fighter Squadron had trained just as hard, if not harder, than their white counterparts. They had passed the same rigorous tests, endured the same grueling exercises, and faced the same hardships. Yet they were constantly told that they had to prove themselves more than anyone else, as if their worthiness to fight for their country was something they had to earn. And even then, it was often in question. The squadron's leaders, like Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., were well aware of the weight they carried. They were not just leading their pilots into battle. They were fighting for the dignity of an entire race. Despite this, they did not falter. They knew that every mission they undertook, no matter how minor it seemed, was a chance to prove their doubters wrong. They remained focused on their mission, understanding that their very existence in the air was a challenge to the prevailing racist attitudes of the time. But their path to proving themselves was anything but easy. The squadron's first real taste of combat came on June 2, 1943, with a mission over the Italian-held island of Pantelleria. The 99th was tasked with providing air support for bombers. As they climbed into the sky in their P-40 Warhawks, they encountered their first German fighters. The battle was intense, but the Tuskegee pilots held their ground. No planes were lost on either side, but the Germans quickly learned that these black pilots were not easily intimidated. They held their formation, protected the bombers, and returned to base with their heads held high. The success of this mission, though minor in comparison to others, served as the first real challenge to the skepticism surrounding the 99th Fighter Squadron. However, this initial success did little to shift the mindset of some of the white commanders. Colonel Mayer, who had initially doubted the squadron's abilities, filed a report suggesting that they lacked aggressiveness and should be pulled from combat missions. He believed the squadron was incapable of handling the more dangerous, high-stakes missions that were being given to other units. This report, though disappointing, did not deter the men of the 99th. They understood that their mission was not just about proving their competence in the air, but also about changing the hearts and minds of those who had been trained to see them as inferior. As the squadron's combat experience grew, so did the pressure to prove themselves. They were given outdated aircraft and kept away from the most critical missions, but they continued to rise to the occasion. Every time they took to the skies, they demonstrated that their training, determination, and skill were on par with any other fighter squadron. But still, the prejudice persisted. Their victories were downplayed, and the challenges they faced were often ignored. The men of the 99th were constantly battling not only the enemy in the sky, but the systemic racial barriers that sought to hold them back. The most significant setback came in the form of the ongoing sabotage of their efforts. Even as the squadron's successes began to mount, they faced continual attempts to undermine their accomplishments. Supplies were delayed, equipment was scarce, and they were often forced to make do with whatever they had. Their planes were outdated and less effective than those used by other squadrons, and yet they were still expected to perform at the same level, if not higher. This disparity in resources was not lost on the men of the 99th, and it only fueled their desire to prove their worth. Despite these obstacles, the 99th continued to fight on. Every mission, every successful sortie, was another step toward proving that they could overcome the prejudice that had been placed in their way. The difficulties they faced were immense, but they did not deter the pilots. They knew that if they were ever going to earn the respect they deserved, they would have to go above and beyond what was expected of them. The challenge was not just in the skies, but in the hearts and minds of the people they fought for. It was a battle against deeply ingrained prejudice and bias, one that would require not only skill and determination, but resilience in the face of adversity. By the time the squadron had completed its first several missions, the Germans had already begun to recognize the 99th Fighter Squadron's effectiveness in combat. But even then, the men of the squadron knew that they would have to continue to fight the battle on two fronts, against the enemy in the air and against the entrenched racism that sought to define them by the color of their skin. This was not just about military success. It was about proving that they were capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with any pilot, no matter their race. It was a fight for dignity, for equality, and for recognition. And the men of the 99th Fighter Squadron were prepared to continue that fight, no matter the cost. On January 27, 1944, the 99th Fighter Squadron found themselves facing the most critical test of their careers. Stationed in Italy, the men of the squadron had already endured months of prejudice, skepticism, and low expectations. Despite having proven themselves in earlier missions, they were still often assigned to less demanding tasks. But that day, everything changed. The squadron's encounter with the German Luftwaffe over the beach at Anzio marked a pivotal turning point in their journey, both in terms of their own recognition and in the perception of their abilities by the wider military establishment. The mission began like many others, a routine patrol over the Mediterranean. But this time, the skies would be different. The Germans, confident in their aerial superiority, had launched a series of devastating raids against the Allied beachhead. The 99th, armed with their outdated P-40 Warhawks, were called into action. The odds were stacked against them, as they were flying older aircraft, while the Germans had the formidable Focke-Wulf 190s and other advanced fighters at their disposal. The squadron had already faced their share of challenges, but now they were about to face the fiercest opposition they had encountered to date. The 99th Fighter Squadron, despite their initial doubts, was ready. The men of Tuskegee had trained relentlessly, honing their skills and mastering the art of aerial combat. They knew that this was their moment, the chance they had been waiting for to prove their worth once and for all. As they climbed into the sky, they knew that their every move would be scrutinized, not only by their fellow pilots, but by the commanders who had doubted them. This was more than just another mission. This was their opportunity to finally silence the naysayers and earn the respect they had long been denied. When they encountered the German fighters over Anzio, the battle that ensued was fierce and unforgiving. The German pilots, expecting a quick and easy victory, were taken by surprise by the aggressive tactics of the Tuskegee pilots. Despite being outnumbered and flying older, less agile aircraft, the 99th Fighter Squadron fought with unparalleled determination. Their discipline, honed through months of rigorous training, paid off. The skies above Anzio became a battlefield where the Tuskegee pilots proved their superiority. In the course of just 2 days, the squadron shot down more than 10 German aircraft, a remarkable achievement that had seemed impossible just days earlier. The success over Anzio was nothing short of a triumph. It was a clear demonstration of the skill, bravery, and tenacity of the Tuskegee pilots. What had once been seen as a mere experiment was now a proven force to be reckoned with. The German Luftwaffe pilots, who had once dismissed the 99th Squadron as no more than a curiosity, were forced to acknowledge their adversaries' skill and determination. The squadron's victory shattered the myths about their capabilities and sent shockwaves through both the Allied and Axis forces. For the men of the 99th Fighter Squadron, this was a moment of vindication. They had fought not just for victory in the air, but for their right to be treated as equals. They had proved that race was no barrier to skill, courage, or excellence. The victory at Anzio marked the turning point in the squadron's history. The very same officers who had previously doubted their abilities were now forced to reconsider their stance. The success of the 99th Squadron could not be denied, and with that success came a new level of respect. The impact of this victory was immediate and far-reaching. The perception of black pilots in the U.S. Army Air Forces began to shift. The skepticism that had once surrounded the 99th Fighter Squadron began to dissipate, replaced by a grudging respect. Their ability to take on the best the Luftwaffe had to offer and to succeed where others had failed proved that they were just as capable as any other fighter squadron. It was no longer a question of whether they could succeed. It was a question of how high they could fly. For the Tuskegee Airmen, the battle over Anzio was a turning point. It marked the beginning of their recognition not only as skilled aviators, but as heroes in their own right. The victory was more than just a military success. It was a social and cultural milestone. The 99th Fighter Squadron had shown that, despite the prejudice and discrimination they faced, they were more than capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with the best. They had proven that race had no bearing on ability, and that they were ready to fight and win for their country. The triumph over Anzio was also a victory for all African Americans who had been told they were less capable, less deserving, or less qualified. It sent a powerful message to the nation that people of color could excel in any field, even in the most demanding and dangerous environments. The pilots of the 99th had fought not only for the freedom of the world, but for the freedom of their own people. Their success was a direct challenge to the racial stereotypes that had been so deeply ingrained in American society. In the months that followed, the 99th Fighter Squadron continued to build on their success. They were given more challenging missions and were finally allowed to prove their worth as bomber escorts, one of the most important roles in the U.S. Army Air Forces. Their success at Anzio had opened the door for further recognition, and with each new mission, they earned the respect of their peers. They were no longer just the experiment that had been doubted by so many. They were a proven and respected force in the skies over Europe. The victory at Anzio proved that, with the right training, discipline, and determination, any obstacle could be overcome. It was a lesson in perseverance and resilience, and it set the stage for the 99th Fighter Squadron to go on to achieve even greater successes in the months that followed. They had proven that they were capable, that they were strong, and that they were worthy of their place in history. The battle for respect was far from over, but Anzio had been a pivotal step toward winning that battle, and it would be remembered as one of the defining moments of the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy. In 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group found themselves thrust into a crucial role that would define their place in history. After their resounding success in the skies over Anzio, the squadron was given a new and more challenging responsibility. They were tasked with escorting American bombers on long-range missions deep into enemy territory. This was a pivotal moment for the Tuskegee Airmen as they transitioned from providing air support to becoming a critical part of the U.S. Army Air Force's offensive strategy. The new role came with immense pressure. The bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, were the backbone of the Allied bombing campaign, targeting key German industrial sites, military installations, and transportation hubs. But these bombers were vulnerable. The Luftwaffe, although weakened, still posed a formidable threat in the air. The German fighters, especially the Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, were a constant danger to the bombers, and it was the 332nd Fighter Group's job to keep them safe. The stakes could not have been higher. The success of the Allied bombing campaign depended heavily on the protection these bombers received. The responsibility was heavy, and the challenges were daunting. The 332nd now had to face the most dangerous and complex missions of their careers. They would fly long distances, sometimes covering over 1,000 miles round trip, and face enemy aircraft that were often more numerous and better equipped. The missions were long, the risk was high, and the outcome was uncertain. The squadron's ability to perform under these conditions would prove whether they were truly ready for the challenges of war, or whether they would fall short, as many had predicted. For the men of the 332nd, this was more than just a military mission. It was their chance to prove themselves in the most critical role of the war. They had already shattered the prejudices that had been placed upon them, but now they had to demonstrate their worth not only to the military but to themselves. Every mission was a test of their skill, endurance, and strategic thinking. They would no longer just be reacting to the enemy. They would have to anticipate and outthink them. The success of each mission was dependent on their ability to work together as a unit, communicate effectively, and execute complex strategies in the heat of battle. The first missions were as difficult as expected. The squadron flew escort for the bombers over heavily defended areas of Nazi-occupied Europe. The Germans, determined to stop the bombers, launched wave after wave of attacks. The 332nd pilots, despite flying older aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk and later the P-51 Mustang, held their ground, using every bit of their training and skill to protect the bombers. The Luftwaffe pilots, who had underestimated these black pilots before, now began to see that they were up against an enemy that was not only well-trained but fiercely determined. The Tuskegee Airmen were no longer a curiosity. They were a formidable force. As the months went by, the squadron's effectiveness in these critical missions grew. They not only succeeded in protecting the bombers, but did so with an efficiency that earned them widespread recognition. The bomber crews, who had once been skeptical of their escorts, now began to request the 332nd Fighter Group specifically for protection. The Red Tails, as they had come to be known because of the distinctive red markings on their aircraft, had proven their worth time and time again. Their bomber protection rate was unmatched. While other fighter groups lost bombers at a higher rate, the 332nd consistently maintained a lower loss rate, earning them the admiration of the crews they protected. The 332nd's success in this new role was not just due to their flying skill. It was also the result of their discipline, teamwork, and tactical ingenuity. They had learned to fly in tight formations, anticipating the movements of the bombers they were protecting and adjusting their tactics on the fly. Their ability to stay with the bombers no matter the danger and their refusal to abandon them for easy kills became a hallmark of their strategy. They knew that their primary mission was not to rack up victories, but to ensure the survival of the bombers they were tasked with protecting. Their sense of duty was unwavering, and it paid off time and time again. By the summer of 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group had become a cornerstone of the Allied air campaign over Europe. Their ability to keep the bombers safe, despite the overwhelming force of the Luftwaffe, had earned them the respect of their commanders and fellow pilots. No longer were they seen as an experiment or an afterthought. They had proven, beyond a doubt, that they were as skilled and capable as any other fighter squadron. Their success in protecting the bombers had become one of the most significant achievements of the war, and it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen. As they continued their missions, the 332nd Fighter Group became legends in their own right. Their story of overcoming adversity, proving their capabilities, and earning the respect of their peers would go on to inspire generations to come. They had not only demonstrated their skill as pilots, but had also changed the course of history by challenging the racist assumptions that had once defined them. They had proven that with hard work, determination, and unity, they could achieve anything. The respect they earned in the skies over Europe would be a lasting tribute to their courage and their indomitable spirit. Their role in the war also had a broader impact. The 332nd Fighter Group was a symbol of the changing social landscape in the United States. Their success in combat challenged the deeply ingrained racial prejudices that had long held African Americans back from achieving their full potential. By proving their worth on the battlefield, they shattered the myth of black inferiority and set the stage for the eventual desegregation of the U.S. military. Their victories were a direct challenge to the ideology of racial discrimination, and they stood as a testament to the power of inclusion, equality, and respect. By the time they completed their missions in Europe, the men of the 332nd Fighter Group had secured a place in history. They had proven that they were not only capable pilots, but heroes who had overcome tremendous odds. They had fought for the freedom of the world, and in doing so, had changed the world for the better. Their journey from underdogs to legends had been one of perseverance, courage, and dignity. And in doing so, they had earned the respect they so richly deserved. By 1944, the Tuskegee Airmen had already established themselves as one of the most skilled and effective fighter groups in the Allied forces. Their victories in the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe, particularly their impressive bomber escort missions, had earned them the respect of their peers and the admiration of their superiors. However, their impact went far beyond military achievements. As they continued to excel in combat, they also became a symbol of the struggle against racial discrimination in both the U.S. military and American society at large. The 332nd Fighter Group's success in combat directly challenged the racial prejudices that had long been ingrained in the military and in American society. In the face of doubt and skepticism from both their commanders and fellow soldiers, the Tuskegee Airmen had fought their way to respect, proving time and time again that race was no barrier to skill, courage, or excellence. Their very presence in the war, fighting side by side with white pilots and protecting the bombers on critical missions, sent a powerful message. African Americans were capable of achieving the highest levels of success, even in the most demanding and dangerous situations. Despite their victories and the mounting evidence of their skill, the Tuskegee Airmen were still not fully recognized by the mainstream media. The American press, largely controlled by white interests and often unwilling to challenge the racial status quo, ignored or downplayed their accomplishments. The media's reluctance to acknowledge their contributions was a stark reflection of the racial biases that persisted in the United States, even as the country was fighting a global war against fascism and tyranny. While the mainstream press often overlooked the achievements of the Tuskegee Airmen, African-American newspapers such as the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender took up the cause. These publications celebrated the victories of the Tuskegee Airmen and used their accomplishments as proof of the need for greater racial equality in America. The success of the Tuskegee pilots became a rallying point for civil rights activists who pointed to the men's heroism as clear evidence that African Americans were just as capable as anyone else and deserved equal treatment in every aspect of life, including the military. The Tuskegee Airmen's accomplishments were not just important for African Americans. They became a symbol for the broader fight against racial discrimination in the United States. As the pilots took to the skies, they were not only battling the Axis powers, but also fighting the deeply entrenched system of racial prejudice that had long oppressed Black Americans. Their success in combat, their professionalism, and their bravery in the face of prejudice helped to challenge the narrative of Black inferiority that had been promoted by racist ideologies for centuries. They showed that African Americans were just as capable of serving their country with distinction as any white citizen. And they did so by defying the odds and proving their worth on the battlefield. However, the Tuskegee Airmen's success was not just a domestic issue. The impact of their achievements was felt internationally, particularly in the way that they were perceived by their enemies. German pilots, who had long been taught to view African Americans as inferior, were forced to confront the reality that the Tuskegee Airmen were a formidable force. The Luftwaffe had underestimated the American pilots, especially those from the 392nd, but they quickly learned to respect them. The Tuskegee pilots, with their skill and determination, earned a nickname from the Germans, Schwarze Vogelmenschens, or Black Birdmen. While the nickname was born out of racism, it also acknowledged the 332nd's effectiveness as combatants. It was a grudging acknowledgement that these men, despite being Black, were a real and formidable threat in the air. As the war continued and the 332nd Fighter Group's reputation grew, so did the awareness of their role in the fight against both fascism abroad and racial prejudice at home. The pilots of the 332nd were more than just soldiers. They became symbols of the changing attitudes towards race in America. Their accomplishments helped to challenge the social order, and their success provided undeniable evidence that African Americans were capable of achieving greatness in any field. But despite the recognition they received on the battlefield and in some quarters of the African American press, the Tuskegee Airmen's struggles were far from over. While they had earned the respect of their fellow soldiers, the larger societal shift they had sparked was slow and difficult. The racism that had shaped their lives before the war did not disappear overnight, and their achievements did not immediately lead to widespread social change. However, the impact of their successes could not be ignored. The Tuskegee Airmen had begun to dismantle the very myths of racial inferiority that had been used to justify segregation and discrimination for generations. Their story was one of perseverance, excellence, and defiance against the forces of prejudice. By demonstrating their capability, courage, and professionalism, the Tuskegee Airmen helped to change the way Black Americans were viewed in the military and in society as a whole. Their victories in the air, their discipline in combat, and their unwavering commitment to their country became a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit and the importance of equality. As their story spread across the world, it became an enduring symbol of the power of resistance against injustice and the potential for change, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. In the years following the war, the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen would continue to resonate. Their contributions to the civil rights movement, the desegregation of the U.S. military, and the fight for racial equality in America were immeasurable. But it was in the skies over Europe, where they fought not just for victory over the Axis powers, but for the respect and dignity of an entire race, that their most significant impact was felt. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that excellence, courage, and honor could transcend race, and that the fight for equality was just as important as the fight for freedom itself. Their legacy would continue to inspire generations of Americans and people around the world who sought justice and equality in the face of prejudice and hate. After the end of World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen, despite their outstanding contributions to the Allied victory, found themselves grappling with the harsh reality of racial inequality back home. Their remarkable achievements in the skies over Europe had earned them the respect of their fellow soldiers and the recognition of their immediate commanders. But the broader American society, still entrenched in deeply rooted racial prejudices, was slow to acknowledge their heroism. The Tuskegee Airmen had performed heroically, consistently protecting bombers on dangerous missions, defeating enemy aircraft, and ultimately playing a critical role in the success of the Allied air campaigns. Yet, as the war came to a close, the black pilots were met with an uncomfortable silence from the nation they had so bravely served. While their white counterparts were celebrated with parades, honors, and public acclaim, the Tuskegee Airmen were often ignored or minimized. Their victories, which had been hard-won against all odds, were not given the full recognition they deserved. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen returned home to find that their military service had not translated into the national recognition or respect they had earned. Parades were held to honor the returning veterans, but the Tuskegee Airmen were rarely invited to participate. Their contributions were overshadowed by the prevailing racial biases that continued to permeate American society. While white veterans were lauded for their heroism, the black pilots, despite their superior records, were largely forgotten or disregarded by the mainstream media and the public. The lack of recognition was not only a blow to their morale, but also a stark reminder of the racial barriers that persisted even after the war. Many of the Tuskegee Airmen had risked their lives in combat, flying some of the most dangerous missions imaginable, and had faced not only the enemy in the skies, but also the pervasive racism of their own country. Yet upon their return, they found themselves relegated to the margins, their achievements dismissed as if they had not fought with the same valor as their white counterparts. Awards, when they came, were delayed. The process of recognizing the Tuskegee Airmen's accomplishments was slow and bureaucratic. Many of the men had to wait for years before receiving the decorations they had earned. Some of the pilots, who had been decorated for their bravery and skill during the war, were forced to endure a long wait for their medals, while their white peers received their honors promptly. The delay in awarding them their due recognition symbolized the ongoing divide between their real achievements and the way society viewed their worth. This gap between the Tuskegee Airmen's accomplishments and the national perception of those accomplishments reflected the deep-seated racism that still existed in American society. While the war had brought about some changes in attitudes toward race, it was clear that African Americans still had to fight not only on the battlefield, but also for their place in the broader narrative of American history. The Tuskegee Airmen's struggle for recognition after the war was a direct challenge to the racial prejudices that had been used to justify segregation and discrimination for decades. Even as the country celebrated the victory over fascism abroad, the Tuskegee Airmen were forced to confront the reality that they were still fighting against racism at home. Their service had shattered many of the stereotypes about Black Americans and their ability to serve in the military, but the public and the government were slow to acknowledge that change. The delay in awarding honors to the Tuskegee Airmen was not just an issue of recognition, but a reflection of the broader struggle for racial equality in the United States. The experiences of the Tuskegee Airmen after the war were also marked by the challenges they faced in reintegrating into society. While they had proven themselves on the battlefield, they returned to a country that still viewed them through the lens of racial prejudice. They were often treated as second-class citizens, denied the benefits and opportunities afforded to white veterans. Many of them struggled to find jobs after the war, and even those who had been highly decorated for their military service faced discrimination in civilian life. Despite these setbacks, the Tuskegee Airmen never gave up the fight for recognition. Their courage and perseverance in the face of adversity became a driving force for the civil rights movement in the years to come. The fight for their rightful place in history was part of a larger battle for equality and justice that would continue for decades after the war ended. It wasn't until years later, in the 1970s, that the Tuskegee Airmen began to receive the recognition they so richly deserved. The efforts of civil rights leaders, historians, and the airmen themselves eventually led to public acknowledgement of their contributions to the war effort. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen was finally being told on a national scale, and their bravery was celebrated with the honors they had long been denied. In 2007, more than 60 years after the end of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow. This recognition came as a culmination of decades of struggle and was a long overdue acknowledgement of their bravery, sacrifice, and the groundbreaking role they played in the history of the U.S. military. Their achievements were no longer denied or overlooked. They were finally recognized as the heroes they had always been. The post-war recognition of the Tuskegee Airmen was a long and difficult journey. They had fought not only against the Axis powers, but also against the racial prejudices of their own country. Their service during World War II helped to challenge the racial ideologies that had long been entrenched in American society. Despite the setbacks they faced, the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy lives on as a testament to their courage, determination, and the ongoing fight for equality and justice in America. In 2007, more than 60 years after their service in World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen were finally honored for their extraordinary contributions to the Allied victory and their groundbreaking role in the U.S. military. The ceremony at the White House, where President George W. Bush awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal, marked the culmination of decades of struggle for recognition. For these men, who had faced years of prejudice and disregard, this moment represented the ultimate vindication. The journey to this recognition had been long and difficult. When the Tuskegee Airmen returned home from their service, their achievements were largely ignored by mainstream American society. Despite their impressive combat record, their bravery, and their role in securing victory over the Axis powers, they were not celebrated in the way their white counterparts were. Many of the black pilots returned to a country that still held fast to racial segregation, where their accomplishments were downplayed and they were often denied the same honors and opportunities as their fellow veterans. For years, the Tuskegee Airmen were overlooked in the national narrative of World War II. Their stories were left out of history books, and their contributions were minimized or erased altogether. The lack of recognition was not just a personal blow to the men who had served in the 392nd Fighter Group. It was a reflection of the deep-seated racial prejudices that persisted in American society. Even as the country celebrated the victory over fascism abroad, it failed to acknowledge the extraordinary sacrifices of the black pilots who had played a vital role in that victory. However, the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy could not be silenced. Over time, civil rights leaders, historians, and activists worked tirelessly to bring their story to light. They fought not only for recognition of the airmen's achievements, but also for the broader recognition of African American contributions to the war effort. The struggle for acknowledgement was intertwined with the broader fight for racial equality and justice in the United States. As the civil rights movement gained momentum, the Tuskegee Airmen's story became a symbol of the fight against racial discrimination and a testament to the power of perseverance in the face of adversity. By the late 20th century, awareness of the Tuskegee Airmen's accomplishments began to grow. Veterans organizations, museums, and documentaries helped to elevate their story, ensuring that future generations would know the truth of their heroism. The 392nd Fighter Group's remarkable success in the skies over Europe, their ability to protect bombers on long, dangerous missions, and their record of shooting down enemy aircraft, began to receive the recognition it had long been denied. But even as their story gained attention, there was still no official recognition from the U.S. government. The turning point came in the early 2000s when efforts to award the Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal gained traction. The medal is one of the highest civilian honors the United States can bestow, and for the Tuskegee Airmen, It was a long overdue acknowledgement of their bravery, skill, and the significant role they had played in shaping the outcome of World War II. The push for this recognition came from many quarters, including the surviving veterans, their families, and a growing number of advocates who believed that the airmen's contributions should be permanently enshrined in American history. In 2007, President George W. Bush signed the bill into law, and a ceremony was held at the White House to officially present the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen. The event was attended by many of the surviving members of the 332nd Fighter Group, who had fought for years to receive the recognition they had earned. The moment was deeply emotional for many of the veterans, who had spent much of their lives struggling to have their achievements recognized by the country they had fought so hard to defend. For these men, the awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal was not just a personal victory, it was a triumph for all African Americans who had been denied recognition and opportunity for generations. It was a recognition of their courage and resilience in the face of adversity, and it marked a moment when America finally began to come to terms with its history of racial injustice. The Tuskegee Airmen's legacy was no longer relegated to the margins of history. It was now a central part of the American story. The awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007 also symbolized a broader societal change. By that time, the United States had made significant strides toward racial equality, but the recognition of the Tuskegee Airmen represented a culmination of decades of progress. The country was now beginning to recognize that the contributions of African Americans, especially in the military, had been essential to the nation's success, and that those contributions deserved to be celebrated and honored. However, the recognition did not come without a sense of irony. While the Tuskegee Airmen had been fighting for equality and respect during and after the war, they had been systematically denied the full benefits of their service. It was only decades later, when much of the original generation of Tuskegee Airmen had passed away, that the government finally acknowledged their incredible sacrifices. Many of the men who had fought so bravely were no longer alive to see the full recognition they deserved, but their legacy was preserved in the actions of the remaining veterans and the efforts of those who had fought for their place in history. The awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal was a victory, but it also highlighted the long history of racial inequality that had been a part of the Tuskegee Airmen's journey. It showed how far the country had come in recognizing the contributions of African Americans, but it also reminded everyone that the struggle for racial justice was not over. The Tuskegee Airmen had been at the forefront of that struggle, and their recognition was a testament to the progress that had been made and the work that still needed to be done. In the end, the awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen was not just about honoring a group of war heroes. It was about acknowledging the larger societal changes that their story represented. It was about recognizing that racial prejudice and discrimination could be overcome, that people of all races and backgrounds could contribute to the greater good, and that every American, regardless of race, deserved to be recognized for their service and sacrifice. The Tuskegee Airmen had fought not only for victory in the skies, but for the right to be seen as equals in the land they had fought to protect. Their ultimate recognition was a testament to their indomitable spirit and the power of perseverance in the face of injustice. In 2007, the Tuskegee Airmen were finally recognized for their exceptional contributions to World War II with the presentation of the Congressional Gold Medal at the White House. This moment of honor marked the culmination of decades of struggle, not only for the recognition of their service, but also for a broader acknowledgement of the challenges they faced. Their heroism was not only in the skies over Europe, but also in the fight against racial prejudice that had long defined their lives and careers. The Tuskegee Airmen, as a group of African American pilots, embodied the very essence of resilience, courage, and excellence, breaking down racial barriers both within the military and American society. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen went beyond their undeniable military achievements. Their impact reverberated through the civil rights movement and beyond, challenging the deeply ingrained racial prejudices of the time. They demonstrated that excellence and valor were not limited by race, and they did so in a way that reshaped the perception of African Americans in the military and in society as a whole. Their legacy challenged long-standing stereotypes and helped lay the groundwork for the eventual desegregation of the U.S. military and advancements in civil rights in the United States. Despite the prejudice and adversity they encountered, the Tuskegee Airmen never wavered in their commitment to their country or their mission. Their perseverance in the face of discrimination, both within the military and in civilian life, showed the true power of human determination. Theirs was a fight for more than victory in the skies. It was a fight to be seen as equals, to have their skills, courage, and sacrifices acknowledged. The respect they earned through their actions on the battlefield served as a powerful counter to the racism that sought to hold them back. Their story was one of incredible perseverance, and their achievements were a direct challenge to the racist ideologies that sought to define the boundaries of who was capable of serving their country. For decades, the Tuskegee Airmen's contributions went largely unrecognized, overshadowed by racial prejudices. Yet, their story is a testament to the importance of recognizing the humanity and capability of all individuals, regardless of race or background. The recognition they received in 2007 was long overdue, but nonetheless significant. It was not only a recognition of their military success, but also an acknowledgement of the social and cultural shifts that their achievements represented. The Tuskegee Airmen had fought for recognition in the skies, and they had won the fight for respect. But their influence extended far beyond the military. Their success was a crucial part of the larger struggle for racial equality in the United States. Their accomplishments helped pave the way for future generations of African Americans who would no longer be limited by the prejudices that had once defined their existence. The significance of the Tuskegee Airmen's story transcends their individual achievements. Their story represents a broader cultural and social change that would shape the course of American history. They demonstrated that racial barriers could be broken, that the achievements of one group could inspire others to rise above discrimination, and that courage and excellence could not be defined by the color of one's skin. The recognition they received, finally, was a step toward a more just and inclusive society, one where individuals are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character and the quality of their deeds. The eventual acknowledgement of the Tuskegee Airmen's contributions was a milestone in the long struggle for racial equality in America. It served as a reminder of the importance of recognizing the value and potential of all people, regardless of race, and of the need to dismantle systems of discrimination that limit the opportunities available to individuals based on their background. Their story remains an enduring symbol of perseverance, a reflection of the progress that had been made, and a reminder of the work that still lay ahead in the pursuit of equality for all. In the end, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen is not just a story of military achievement. It is a story of overcoming adversity, of breaking down barriers, and of proving that excellence knows no racial boundaries. Their bravery and skill in the skies were matched only by their determination to challenge the injustice that sought to define them by the color of their skin. The recognition they received was not just about honoring their service in the military, but about honoring their role in reshaping the future of American society. The Tuskegee Airmen's legacy is one of triumph over adversity. It is a legacy that continues to inspire future generations to rise above prejudice and to fight for equality. Their story is a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is ongoing, but it is also a testament to the progress that can be achieved when individuals are given the opportunity to prove their worth. The Tuskegee Airmen not only helped secure victory over Nazi Germany, but also helped win a battle for equality that continues to resonate in the United States today.